NPR recently released a piece criticizing the NoFap movement. And if you consume men's personal development at all, you are probably familiar with this already. If not, you will be by the end of this video. And I myself have had my criticisms of NoFap, but I found this piece by NPR to be particularly infuriating, as many men did.
It was like a completely unidirectional. It's like when you set out to write a story that you know you want the headline to be.
There were a bunch of obvious things to be upset about with this poor bit of journalism. The author miscontextualized a bunch of quotes, including from high school age boys. There were she conflated right-wing politics into the NoFap movement, and she even said it was misogynistic to tell young men to abstain from porn and masturbation. Are you kidding me? You're saying it's misogynistic to tell young men to not objectify hypersexualized images of women? But I'm not going to rant about all of that as much as I would like to, because there's something beyond the obvious and even beyond the content of the article that needs addressing. This piece is a piece of propaganda that is encouraging the cultural denial of the male experience. And I don't want to sound like an angry red pill guy, but this is part of a war on the male nature. At the end of my recent video on the mother complex, I briefly spoke about how culture disincentivizes men from growing up. It encourages men to stay as boys and seek the metaphoric mommy in society. This article seeks to normalize weakness and dysphoria in men, and it's actually a very skillful piece of propaganda because it flies so well under the radar and frames anyone who gets upset about it as crazy. Now, I don't blame any woman for not understanding, because it's hard to really get something that's far outside of our experience. Just as there are many female experiences that men like myself will never really get. Maybe we can do our best to sympathize, but we won't really get it if we don't experience it. And this is one of these things. Porn addiction, especially in the age of streamable internet porn and the downstream negative effects that come from it, it's, I would imagine, very hard for a woman to understand because it doesn't affect women in the same way. So in this episode, I'm going to cover two things. One is the content of the article, because actually she did point to some things that are worth looking at about men's personal development. They were misinterpreted, so we're going to correct those there. And then we're going to zoom out and look at the cultural impact of this, because it's not even about the article itself. The article perhaps is a microcosm of a greater thing at play in culture that is very negative and perhaps attacking not only the male nature, but human nature. The article did employ some dark arts as far as propaganda and manipulations. We're going to break that down for the purpose, of course, of freeing yourself from it and living your best life. So first, I do want to address what was valid about the article. We do not want a straw man here. And there are some things, I've had my own criticisms of NoFap, having been in the personal development for quite a while. And there's actually three things I do want to cover that she kind of touched on in the article, but didn't really get. So the first is this idea that abstaining from porn and masturbation for 90 days gives you so-called superpowers. Now, of course, this is meant semi-facetiously. However, any man who has experienced being drained by a pornographic addiction will probably notice that just the change from that diminished, grayed out, weakened state going back to what should be normal, which is they have a healthy libido and they're not, wasting it away to images on a screen. That 0 to 1 change can actually feel like superpowers in the sense that it's such a great change. And this is something I bring up every time I speak about male sexuality, which is that to the male psyche, sex is not really about sex. At least in the sense, it's not about pleasure. It's about self-worth. This is why men specifically get addicted to pornography. Yes, women watch porn. They might get turned on about it, but you don't hear about female porn addicts too much. If you think about the way a man typically pleasures himself to an image of a beautiful woman on a screen having sex with someone else, what it's doing is tricking his primal subconscious that, hey, there is a desirable woman who desires to be intimate with you. There's a desirable woman who wants to have you inside of her. Therefore, you are a worthy man. Now, of course, with the superpowers thing, there are other things that add to this idea. There's a lot of spiritual, esoteric practices, such as from Taoism and Tantra, which perhaps have heightened this idea of superpowers. And full disclosure, I've probably contributed to this myself. I have a course called Arousal Control Secrets, inspired by my study with Montauk Chia some years ago. But even back then, I made the choice to use the term arousal control rather than the more popular semen retention, because I felt like that term kind of misses the point. It's not about whether you come or not, or how many times you come, or how many days you can go without coming. The point is to gain mastery over your libido, which, yes, has some performance benefits in the bedroom, but the real thing is about your ability to be a man in life, right? To communicate with women intimately or not intimately, to have that self-esteem, that sense of self-worth that comes from a man that has mastery over his libido. Which leads into my next criticism of abstinence as a life purpose. You see all these NoFap guys hyper focused on their streaks. All of their energy is going into basically not doing something, which of course is setting themselves up to do it eventually. And if this is what all you're focused on and you're fueled by this emotion of shame, this is the primary thing you're feeling, of course you're going to mess up. Of course you're going to, so-called relapse. And it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is maybe the one thing that the article really got correct. In my course, I make this analogy of arousal being a currency like money. You can spend it, you can save it, or you can invest it. So for a guy who's draining himself with PMO, it's like a guy who's overly spending and now he's in debt. So obviously things are not good. He can't do the things he wants to do. And NoFap is great for this because it's telling men to stop overspending, stop putting yourself in debt and save. But if all you're focused on is saving, you're kind of like Scrooge McDuck, but with your libido. It's okay to come sometimes, especially when you choose to. It is great to do that with a partner in an intimate exchange. These are parts of the human experience. You don't want to abstain from this for the rest of your life. You just want to have control over it. And my last issue with NoFap is the addict labeling. Now, I do understand why NoFap became conflated with theories or language around substance abuse. You see guys speaking about using porn as if they're talking about heroin or something like that. And largely because in our society, sexual consumption is so greatly normalized. Perhaps you do need harsh language to get people's attention. And in our society, 12-step AA is the dominant view of addiction. So it makes sense that that language would be translated to pornographic use. But I do have a hot take on this because I actually disagree with the first step in the 12 steps. This idea of labeling yourself as an addict. I can see how maybe in the short term it has some benefits, but I have a lot of friends in recovery and maybe they'll all be mad at me for saying this, but many years ago, I was working on a film and there are two people who had a history of alcoholism. There's this guy he wasn't from America, so maybe this is why he didn't, adopt the 12-step model, but he said something like, "Oh yeah, I used to be an alcoholic in my 20s. So now I just make sure, I'll just have like a beer or something, but I'm kind of past that phase." And there was a young woman, an actress, who said, "I am an alcoholic. Therefore I can never drink again. I can't touch it. It would make me go crazy." And I thought it was very interesting because they were both, recovered supposedly, but one said, "Oh, I was an addict and now it's in my past. It's not my identity anymore. It was a phase of my life." The other one, inspired by the 12-step program, says, "I am an addict. I can never go near the thing ever," right? And I understand when it comes to something you don't have control over, it is much better advice to just abstain from it forever. And, I do think when it comes to porn, for instance, most guys, even if you don't have a problem, you'd probably be better off if you just abstained. I don't think it necessarily brings anything to anyone's life. You could argue that for alcohol. You could argue that for maybe any pleasurable vice. But this labeling of an addict is actually a self-limiting thing, and actually I think drives the shame and maybe increases the risk of spinning out of control. And actually Eric Berne, the founder of transactional analysis, would say that someone who labels themselves as an addict is actually still playing the same game, just without alcohol. We call this a dry drunk, like someone who has all the behaviors of an addict, but maybe they're just avoiding their substance of choice for the time being. So one thing this article did is that it associated this attempt of men to better themselves with bigotry, specifically the bigotry that is in vogue to talk about today, which is misogyny and racism. Accusing someone of being a bigot today is like accusing someone of being a commie in the McCarthy era. It's a way of putting someone in a box where they are the other, they are not to be trusted, they're not even to be seen as humans. On the racist thing, the author of the article said that white supremacist groups often encourage masturbation abstinence or porn abstinence to its members. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But to say that because some racist group practices a certain thing, that practice is now racist is a ridiculous leap of logic. That's like saying because Hitler studied neoclassical art, that neoclassical art is Nazi. And the misogyny piece is crazy because it goes directly against what feminists have been saying for years about pornography.
90% of scenes have violence against women in them. Pornography shapes the way men think about women. It changes the way they think about rape. It changes the way they think about their own masculinity. masculinity. It encourages violence against women.
Now, to be fair, I never really understood this assertion that pornography degraded women in the storylines, at least. Maybe it's not the stuff that I was into, but I did assert in the Mother Complex video that the two biggest categories consumed by men these days are hentai stuff and MILF stuff, which suggests that men are in a boyhood psychological phase, but also that perhaps this idea of female degradation just isn't that popular anymore. Now, this contradiction doesn't make sense unless you recognize that it is an indoctrination technique. The content doesn't actually matter. The point is to slap men for any self-initiative leading to independence and strength. It is the mother complex of society trying to keep grown men in a psychological boyhood. Now, I've experienced this indoctrination technique in various settings. When I was in OCS for the Marine Corps, in basic training, this is a common thing where you kind of get yelled at or punished for anything you do. You try to do this thing, they yell at you, they punish you. So you try to correct your behavior, they yell at you and punish you in the other way. And it's not really about learning rules as much as training compliance. In the military, training conformity. It's an important thing in the military. And of course, if you know my story, once upon a time I was in a cult, specifically a female-led matriarchal cult, which did a lot to control independence and specifically masculinity at times. There were a bunch of times where maybe I would do something on my own initiative. I would be slapped or shamed. Oh no, you shouldn't have done that. That's bad for your spirituality. Okay. And then a few months later, they would suggest that we would do the thing that I suggested, right? Because it was never about the thing, right? It's that any kind of independent thought is declared as wrong, which if you accept that frame, puts you into a kind of childlike state of dependence where, of course, you can be controlled. And I've actually seen this in a lot of couples that I've coached where the man is committed to being a good man, being a good husband or boyfriend, under a feminist lens, under a feminist morality where the woman is always right and her feelings are always what needs to be followed. So the man, in an attempt to be a good guy, ends up in this reactive state because he's trying to do the right thing, but the right thing in the given moment is determined by the woman's feelings. And of course, women's feelings change. So he can never foresee what is right. He ends up being in this reactive kind of childlike state, which of course is not fulfilling to either party in the couple. And it's not that a man can't be empowered while also caring about women's rights and well-being. I mean, I have a wife and a daughter. I want the best for them. But I stopped calling myself a feminist many years ago because the connotations associated with that morality ultimately lead to male submission, which leads to the next issue with the article. So the article subtly and not so subtly was encouraging rewarding male submission. The article used this example of a guy named Derek who tried the NoFap thing due to religious shame, failed a bunch of times, felt bad about himself, and therefore the solution was to go back to giving in to all of his whims and using porn without shame. It's actually a logical trick, a logical fallacy that because the premise is true. And actually I agree. Like I said that earlier, the premise that your focus should be just about hitting a 90-day or 6-month streak and that's all you focus on. It's setting yourself up for failure and it's actually short-sighted. I agree with that. Therefore, the direct opposite of it must be true. It's not true, right? There's actually more options there besides giving into every whim or focusing on abstaining like there's nothing else that matters in your life. Going back to this spending, saving, investing analogy, to any guy dealing with this, I always say, it, of course, is better to not be wasting this energy, but this energy is meant for doing something with, for investing. It's literally meant for creating life. It's also metaphorically meant for creating your life. Focus on building something, and that will actually inspire you to not go back to wasting it again. Hey, and real quick, if you want to learn how to master your libido, how to invest your sex drive, so to speak, you can check out Arousal Control Secrets. There's my free training with an exercise that anyone can try right away. And there's also the advanced program should you choose to continue with a step-by-step system based in Taoist sexual practices. I started studying sexuality intensively many years ago simply because I had psychogenic ED and I thought I had to get on the blue pill and there are negative health effects to that. And I found that these practices really helped me. They really taught me how to heighten my virility, but also harness it. So if you want to learn that, you can check that out at arousalcontrolsecrets.com. There's the free training and also links to the advanced course. And the truth is, if you can't go 90 days or some significant amount of time without abstaining from some pleasure, right? It could be anything, right? I don't think, I actually don't think masturbation, I don't even think porn use in control and moderation is not the worst thing in the world. Just like alcohol can be used responsibly, or television or any other pleasurable vice. But if you can't abstain from it, if you don't have control over it, then it is a problem. So for this Derek guy, the fact that he couldn't make it 90 days without this pleasure that is really not doing anything for his life, that actually is a sign that he probably really should abstain from it. Like, it's actually already causing problems in his life if he doesn't have any control over it. Because it's like the thing that substance addicts say, like, oh yeah, I can stop whenever I want. No, if you're actually in control, you should choose to stop periodically just to prove to yourself that you are in fact the master of your domain.
But are you still master of your domain?
I am king of the county. You?
Lord of the manor.
And this article's stance is kind of like normalizing alcoholism or normalizing obesity. Oh, it doesn't matter. All that matters is you feel good in the moment. No, it's not. You will not be happy if you're a slave to a vice. You are trading sustainable happiness for momentary comfort. You are trading away your freedom. And again, this might go back to the thing that I think is hard for women to understand, that for men, sex is not about pleasure. It's about self-worth. It's about self-validation. It's about perhaps something that's a lot more existential than just feeling good in the moment. Because when a guy is compulsively masturbating, it's usually not about arousal, or even the horniness that might come up is not even a real horniness. It's about an urge to escape something, to escape stress, escape loneliness, frustration, not knowing what to do with himself, being lost around his purpose or his life, right? In fact, this kind of thing, and I've coached a lot of guys through this, where they get randomly horny or seemingly horny, this urge to ejaculate when things are not going so well in their life. So PMO might temporarily relieve the urge, but it leaves an even worse feeling in its wake, because the thing that relieves self-destructive urges is connection. And this is one of the things that actually I think my cult, One Taste, the cult I was in, got right, which is they said that most people are in an oxytocin deficit, and they promoted this practice called orgasmic meditation, which is this intimate practice that involved no pleasuring of the man. And every guy I know who did this thing, including myself, all of a sudden lost interest in porn. It's not like our libidos went away. Our libidos maybe went up, but we lost our interest in porn. It's like once our connection bucket was full, it actually seemed really strange. Actually, because of the fact that I had no interest in porn for the first time in my life, I actually tried watching porn a couple times afterwards, and it just seems so strange and dystopian to be sitting in a bedroom with the windows closed, watching other people have sex on a screen. It was like, I actually found it kind of like, it's just weird. Because again, these urges have very little to do with sex. I'll admit my worst PMO urges, other than puberty, was actually a couple years ago. It was after my One Taste experience. I was actually in a relationship where our sex life was okay. We were doing it pretty regularly, but every other part of the relationship, I felt very dissatisfied. I felt my emotional needs were ignored. I had a lot of resentments built up, but we were still sleeping together regularly. And it was the weirdest thing where I would, spend time with her. We would do it. It would be fine. I would go back to my place, and because of built up resentments and feelings of disconnection, I felt like I had to watch porn again. And it had nothing to do with arousal, because I had just had real sex and I was shooting blanks, but it was like I had to do this because I felt so dysphoric. It was like I wanted to escape my body. I wanted to escape the relationship or the situation I was in. And this was the way I was trying to do it. It had nothing to do with sexual arousal, actually. And the last thing I want to address about the article is that it stressed that the NoFap assertions are not scientifically backed. And I really thought this was up. She cited Gary Wilson, who gave a viral TED Talk. In the article, she introduced him as a massage therapist, which I'm sure is true. I'm sure he worked as a massage therapist at some point. But to introduce him with that labeling is specifically a way to diminish any credibility he might have. Because while I'm sure he did that at some point in his life, all of us have countless labels that would be accurate, but not necessarily relevant to the thing we're doing in a given moment, right? Like, I've had countless menial jobs in my life, but to introduce my opinions as coming from a former busboy, I would say is a form of slander. It's like introducing Hitler as a former art student, or Abraham Lincoln as, a guy who used to split rails or something, The only relevant labeling of Gary Wilson is that he ran a website called Your Brain on Porn, which is a collection of scientific information from peer-reviewed studies. And even more relevant is that Gary Wilson himself, despite being a massage therapist, had 2 peer-reviewed studies with relevant information on how pornography affects the brain. And while the article cherry-picked the opinions of some professionals who disagree with NoFap, YourBrainOnPorn.com also has a list of 150 medical professionals who do agree with it. All of this information is in the About section of the website that any person could find. You would imagine an investigative journalist would have read this as well. And on top of all of this, the article's author was using these pretty deceptive criticisms of a guy who's been dead 3 years. Gary Wilson passed away a number of years ago, which I think is pretty morally f***ed up. In conclusion, NoFap is a collective attempt by men to overcome a self-destructive behavior that is encouraged by modern society and technology. And you can argue, I would argue, that in some instances, it's a bit of the blind leading the blind, which you actually see in almost all personal development spaces. And masturbating to pornography is not an absolute evil, but it is a pleasurable vice that most would be better off without. And just like alcohol or any substance, to certain people who maybe are vulnerable, it can be extremely damaging in the long run, specifically for young men in this case. Therefore, any attempt to get away from it or control these urges or direct focus to something else and abstain from it is, of course, a wildly positive thing, because a man does need control over his urges, control over his libido to be happy, fulfilled, and empowered to be a good husband, a good father, a good member of society, a leader, pretty much anything except a cog in a wheel. So anything telling or suggesting or even insinuating to you that you should not be strong, that you should not have control, that you should give in to your whims and not seek self-mastery is wrong and is trying to control you. Goodbye.